And
broadcasting.
we're broadcasting.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
We are in week 4. We are in the saggy middle of our course, in which we discuss saggy middles. There, look, Andrew's sagging.
I am sagging as we speak.
A not saggy enough course, I think, according to some people. We seem to be moving at lightning speed, and I know that some of you feel that you're getting behind, but it's totally okay. Do remember, we are not expecting you to get necessarily your complete outline done in these 6 weeks. It's a big task because what we're asking for is something that's quite detailed.
Oh, and I mean, writers often take months.
And writers often, the smart ones, the more time you put in the front, the less time you're putting in down the road. So this is a very detailed process. It can take a long time. There's no expectation that you're finishing in these 6 weeks. Remember, too, that you will have access to all of these materials in perpetuity. Just not the discussions. Those will get locked at a certain point, but
you
everything
can still
else
read the discussions.
You can read them. You can go back and watch these and these hangouts, and all of the lectures and stuff will be archived, and you can access it whenever. So you can come back to it again and again. Andrew has his finger in the air.
And this is the time when I will mention that we have created an online discussion forum for all our alumni. So in week 6, we will give you access to that, so that once you're finished here, you can still continue conversing with your.
Over there.
Yes, you can even make writing groups and all sorts of things. So we just started
already having separation anxiety at the prospect of the course being over. So we should dive in.
Okay.
Yes, the saggy middle, and this is where people often get bogged down in that second act. And we talked about a number of ways of dealing with this. And we talked about subplots in particular, because that tends to be a big kind of driver. I'm seeing a wheel turning there, moving us through the muddy sort of molasses of the second. I don't know why my mind is going to
molasses.
Farming. Never before, never again. Somehow
perhaps your next novel will be a farm drama.
Most likely not.
Okay.
And we did get to resolution, the third act, as well. So if there's time, we will force our ways through the saggy middle of this hangout and get to the resolution at the end.
Well, we will get to the resolution because we have things to do afterwards.
Yes.
Assignment number 1.
Yes.
Troubleshooting. So we asked you to consider the middle of your own novels and discuss any problems you're running into and some possible solutions to those problems. So it was great to see how many of you are analyzing and questioning your choices, and how many are using the tools we've been discussing these past few weeks to work on ways out of the common issues that all writers have with their story middles. A few things that people were wrestling with included making dark subject matter enjoyable to read. Always an interesting one.
Yeah.
Finding good points of conflict.
And enough points of conflict.
Conflict. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something. Working with flashbacks.
Yes.
When to dip.
The wells. Dipping into those wells.
For a refreshing glass of backstory.
That's right. That's right.
Pacing and keeping the reader interested. Creating and or fleshing out the midpoint. Okay, I mean, these are things that all writers have to work through again and again.
Oh, are we missing a chunk of something?
I think it's just a weird page break.
Weird that got page.
The weird page break.
Okay, sorry. We just turned to a very blank page and suddenly thought, oh no, we've missed a whole bunch of comments. So then we're talking about assignment 2. We asked you to think about your favorite books or movies and identify that moment where we cross from Act 1 into Act 2, that crossing the threshold moment at the Act 1 climax. And we also wanted you to try and locate your midpoint and your crisis at the end of Act 2.
Yeah.
So we asked you to post examples of these stories where they were both clear, and then examples of stories where these were unclear. And overall, of course, you guys had an easier time finding films with the clear 3-act structure, because of course this is a structure that we import and borrow from very much from screenplay, which is much more rigid and formulaic than we have to be in the novel. And then many of you confessed to having difficulty finding works with unclear structures, which is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I remember from previous versions of this course.
Certainly in the world of film. I mean, in the novel world,
it's pretty common. A lot of people look at a book and go, I don't know, is there a structure here at all? And usually there is, but it's maybe a little more subtle. Film, I guess experimental films, perhaps.
Yeah, little indie films, although even there, I mean, whenever you're dealing with a large-scale narrative, something that's having to pull you forward through time, you need those things of interest that are going to keep you pulled forward. And that's why all of these sort of architectural points that we're talking about, these structural moments, are so archetypal and are so key. It doesn't make your work kind of hackneyed and overly traditional because you're relying on things like crisis and climax. It's like saying, oh, breakfast is so hackneyed. It's so overdone. I mean, you still need breakfast, right? You still need those
You still need
plot moments to keep pulling your reader, your viewers' attention forward and to keep them with the work, to keep them engaged with the work.
Yeah. I'm going to read out a few examples.
Yes, please do that.
So people thought that these were clear examples of film. Local Hero. I haven't seen that for a long time. The Hobbit.
Yes.
A Star is Born. How to Train Your Dragon. Star Wars: A New Hope. The English Teacher. Gone in 60 Seconds. Girl on a Train. The Princess Bride. 13 Going on 30. Woman Talking. Mrs. Doubtfire. And Ocean's 11. And then unclear. Let's see if we can. Certain Woman. Dear Evelyn. Can You Ever Forgive Me? I saw that recently. That was really good.
I have not seen that.
Life After Life, Gone Girl, Avengers: Infinity War, 100 Years of Solitude, Our Souls at Night, Beautiful Boy, The Girl Who Was Saturday Night, Brother, and Fried Green Tomatoes. Interestingly, Crazy Rich Asians appeared in both the clear and unclear categories. There were also some questions in particular around stories that have two parallel storylines, one present and one past, such as the film Fried Green Tomatoes and the novel Brother by David Cheriandy.
Yes. So I would suggest that I haven't seen Fried Green Tomatoes in a very long time.
Yeah, same here. It's been a long time.
And I confess I haven't read Brother, although I am looking for it. So you know how you save the little stack of books for end of term? And Brother is sitting right on top there for me, but I haven't read it yet. But I would say in general, having worked with a novel structure where some of it's present, some of it's past, overall we're analyzing the sort of the complete arc of the thing, and that's likely going to be the present story.
Yeah.
Those past moments or wells or flashbacks or whatever you want to call them are there for the purpose of informing the present tense story. So when you're doing this kind of analysis, it makes the most sense because they're not working independently of each other. So you want to be focusing for the most part on that present tense story.
Yeah, definitely.
And certainly you can have climactic moments that are informed by someone discovering something that happened in the past, but you're really looking at the present.
I would strongly agree. I mean, it's
Have
all.
You seen Crazy Rich Asians?
I haven't seen Crazy Rich Asians. That's on my list to watch when I have a weekend for something fun. So I can't talk about that one, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But I will say that.
I bet you've seen Avengers Infinity War.
I have seen Avengers Infinity War. Is it in clear? Well, I mean, the thing about Avengers Infinity War is that it is a very closely linked first part to a second part.
Yeah, it's a sequel, isn't it?
Well, there's a bunch of movies, but it stands on its own as a movie, except that it would be, and I'm not going to give away too many spoilers at this point since it's been a year and everyone who wants to see it has seen it. It ends on a very down note with the antagonist triumphing. And the fact that everyone knows there's going to be a sequel, I think, affects that to some degree.
Yeah, it's kind of
There's still a climax. I mean, if you think about it, the moment when everyone gathers and has the big battle and the antagonist ends up triumphing, I mean, there's a climax. It just doesn't end well for our main.
Is it kind of like the Harry Potter number 7 part 1, number 7 part 2?
I think it's a little bit like that, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and maybe why it's partly unclear because also, when you think of a movie like Avengers, I mean, that's an ensemble movie, so there's multiple storylines, multiple characters. It's also like the fourth in a series that's almost come to an end. So again, it's probably closer to the Harry Potters in a way, in that, most people would not have come to that movie without knowing anything about what came before.
Should we talk about assignment 3?
Let's talk about assignment 3.
We should probably get away from Movie Land and back into book.
Yes. So for this assignment, you posted breakdowns from one scene for your novel, which you found particularly challenging.
I love this assignment.
Yes, it was great to see everyone wrestling with their stories and making sobering realizations, as well as breakthroughs. It's all part of the process, and it will go on for some time. So speaking of breakthroughs, we noticed that several of you used this assignment to explore the problems that you were having as you wrote your response, and then found that the very act of writing it all down actually served to generate new ideas and potential solutions. I also find explaining something to someone, if someone asks you what your book is about and they actually want to hear it in more than like a sentence, and you start telling them, you will fairly quickly start realizing things about it when it makes sense, when it comes out, when it makes sense, when it doesn't. Yeah, so that's really useful. And this is a great moment to note that the assignments on the course will be useful throughout the writing process and long after this course is ended. I know that a lot of students will come back at different points in their book and look at one of the courses they've taken with us.
Yeah.
And we encourage you to do that because.
And I have to say, speaking on Nancy's behalf as well, so many of these assignments that we're giving you are just tools and techniques that we use in our own writing to get us out of places when we're stuck, or to try and look at things with fresh eyes, or reimagine how we might approach a certain scene. So it's not so much that these are kind of artificial things that we've cooked up for the sake of a course. This is actually what we use to get our own writing done. So
I mean,
hopefully you will find these useful again.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I've used these myself. I mean, I am actually in the middle of a rewrite where I'm looking at my second act and realizing the pacing is not so good. So I'm going to be going back to some of these to crack on that. To fix. So
coming to questions now. Carpenter Cynthia 71. My story needs focus in order to plot the order of events in my novel. So the scene-by-scene outline is the first exercise I am struggling with and keep putting off. Oh, I think we touched on this one very briefly last week, and we've got a little more information here. I was excited about how my characters were fleshed out through the list of questions, that character questionnaire, which also developed a bit of plot line. I have written strong scenes that I like, but I need to develop an order for all the acts in the novel to know which one goes first. I feel I need more reflective time for this to unfurl. I need to focus on exactly what my story is. Maybe all my ideas aren't pertinent to this novel, and likewise, I may need different areas of exploration in order to tell the story. Any tips on how to go about this?
My first tip is I wouldn't worry too much about the fact that you don't have it all yet.
No.
Because it takes a while. And especially if you're just starting the novel, I mean, you may have started 3 weeks ago putting all this stuff down. That is early days.
If you started a year ago, it's early days.
Yeah, I mean, novels, honestly. Many novels can take several years, right?
Yeah.
To write. And a lot of, you need some time to sit with these ideas and to start testing things out and to think. I mean, one of the ways I've heard it described is, at a certain point you have an infinity of branching paths and you have to start closing those off and trying to move your characters in a way that works with dramatic structure, that works with who they are as characters. It's going to take a while.
I mean, the first thing that I would say concretely, when I'm looking at the information you've given us, you really enjoyed developing characters, plural, with your character questionnaires. So my first question is, do you have one who's kind of popping their head up as your protagonist? Do you know yet who that is? Because you're not going to be able to figure out what the storyline is that you want to drill down to and the order of everything until you know who is our guide through all of this, who is the character that we're following from beginning to end. So I'd say you need to pick your protagonist. Then you need to determine the protagonist's sort of drivers. What do they want through the course of the story? What are they pursuing? What's that decision that they're going to make that's committing them to something? What is that going to look like? What are the forces of antagonism that are lined up against your protagonist, or, working in opposition to your protagonist, and how are they going to factor in? So, so much is going to turn, and I don't see, and you say you've written strong scenes that you like,
right.
And what I'm kind of missing is who's the focus? Because when you've got that detail, it's not a detail. When you've got that sort of, when you lay the first stone putting in a building,
cornerstone?
Cornerstone, thank you. Your protagonist is your cornerstone. When you have that, then you can start to build out the rest. You can't build out the rest and say, well, I'm going to make that decision later. I've got a big cast and I love them all and I'm going to decide later. You need to know who's your person or people, who are your main person or people. Work out what they want, work out how to take it away or how to bring resistance to that with the forces of antagonism. And then start thinking about the big sweep. Start thinking about those full, that full 3-act kind of, I wouldn't start doing the scene kind of stuff for Act 1 when you have no sense of where we're going sort of later on in the novel. But I think your very first step, Carpenter Cynthia, is do that character work, really zooming in on your protagonist in particular and seeing how, they can provide the shape of the novel.
Yeah, and I'd add one thing. I noticed here you write, I need to develop an order for all the acts in the novel to know which one goes first. I mean, one thing I think you want to think about is when you're putting a novel together and you have your character and you have their desire. I mean, things should happen because of something. There should be the progression of events should
I have a feeling they don't mean acts like in the sense of dramatic acts. I think they mean like the actions in the novel. Right, like they're trying to decide.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But yes, I mean, there should be a sort of cause
Because, I mean, I've heard it
described.
described this way. Is that you don't say something happens and something happens and something happens. It's more like something happens, which causes something to happen, which
And
causes
then,
something to happen,
yeah.
and then that causes. I mean, there's a causal chain
Yeah,
between everything that happened in your novel until the end.
that's right. That's right.
Okay, hopefully that's useful. It will take a while, the process, but Annabelle has very good advice.
Well, yeah, I'd say start zooming in.
Zoom in.
That's what she needs to do. Aaron AG.
Aaron A.G., the outline of a non-linear story.
Mm.
So this was posted to the week 3 Hangout questions. It may be more of a comment discussion topic, but we'll quickly run through it. Several examples came up in the discussions, both of published works and students' own projects, of stories that were non-linear in their telling, but were ultimately about a linear story, as opposed to, say, detective fiction. I'm thinking the story itself could be mapped to a 3-act structure in terms of rising action, climax, denouement, whereas the telling, so to speak, would in turn have its own structure. This would tie back to the earlier videos on form. How do those different forms affect the architecture? I personally say there's an overall structure to Cloud Atlas that could be mapped to a 3 or 4-act architecture, but I don't know. I would say something like that for a book like Never Let Me Go.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about the nonlinear story. It comes up a couple of times in a couple of different contexts, I think, in our Hangout this week. And there's a couple things that I'd want to say about that right off the bat. Nonlinear doesn't mean disorganized. And
Right.
there's always going to be beneath the surface kind of combobulation, there's going to be an order underneath that the artist, that the writer has carefully planned out. So it may be one of those things where it's like watching that movie Memento, where
Yes.
your first 3 watches through, you're like, I have no idea what's going on. But gradually you'll figure it out. You know, you'll get a sense for what's going on, and then you can start to do that analysis. And you know, I think it's also what we were talking about a little bit before, where you might have 2 stories operating in 2 different timelines. How are you mapping climaxes where something's in 1940 and something's in 1800 and something's in 2096? I'm thinking of Cloud Atlas, since that was the example that we were given. Again, I would say you want to look at the full scope of the thing. Cloud Atlas is an interesting one. It uses that step pyramid shape, and he's got, I think it's
6 or 7.
It's a 7-layer cake, that one. And supposedly the way he wrote it was he wrote each of the stories complete as a novella and then sat down on the floor with a pair of scissors and chopped them all up and spliced them all together. So you can see there is the order beneath the surface disorder. And of course, there was a reason why he chose to use that particular structure, because he was saying something about repetition and the cyclical nature of time. And that's why he had to use the structure that he did. But I would say, when you're dealing with a non-linear, awkwardly chronological or non-chronological story, you want to be looking, sort of drop beneath the chaos and see what kind of order the writer has imposed there. It's harder work to do that kind of analysis, but it'll be there.
Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, every story is about something that happened that is worth telling.
Yeah.
There's someone told me, we just came back from a conference, AWP in Portland, and someone was telling me about a writer who gave a talk, about a very interesting talk. Matt Bell, his name is, he's an author. He was talking about how our minds construct story, and he had his notes for his talk. And at the start of the talk, he threw them up, dropped them on the ground, picked them up in a random order, and then started reading. And he gave his talk and he said, your minds will put the talk together.
He would have lost me at that point.
However, the point is not that you can do anything you want. The point is that he wrote
John Cage approach to giving a presentation.
It's an interesting idea, but the point was that he wrote something first. Like it has structure. What he did had a structure, beginning, middle, and end. And then he reshuffled it in a way to solve as a puzzle for the audience. But the underlying structure is still there. It has to be there, right?
Has to be there, yeah.
Okay, Adam Reyes. Gender and ethnicity, sensitivity, and arc. What is the correct way to balance issues of sensitivity when the protagonists are associated with a certain gender group, i.e. LGBT, and the antagonists are associated with certain ethnicity groups, i.e. German? In the story, the yearnings for the protagonist, who is from this group, LGBT, are the promotion of naturally based health cures, while the antagonists are promoting better health through nanotechnology, however with potential risks of deadly side effects which are not disclosed due to the high profit of the product. Would the arc of a character be too obvious if he or she recanted their oath with the gender group and joined the other group due to the resolution of their bisexual identity? So, falling in love with a German, does love trump group-based affinity? That's a bit unclear to me.
Okay, no, it's okay.
Oh.
And then they provide a little bit more.
Sorry,
sort of-
Anna asked for some clarification.
And then they provided a little bit more, but basically, what are there? I understand the question that's being asked. Are there potential gender and ethnicity issues with the novel if you're taking, you know, your protagonist from one particular group and then your antagonist from another particular group? I think the concern, and you can, Adam Reyes, tell me if I'm wrong here, and we can revisit this question next week. But I'm guessing you're saying, does it look as though somehow I am painting all of that group with a particular brush? All Germans antagonists, all Germans bad. I think it's going to come down to a few things. It's going to come down to the way in which you execute and the degree to which you are or are not relying on archetypes or stereotypes.
Right.
If you're bringing in a lot of concrete sensory detail, a lot of really unique and particular detail that we haven't seen elsewhere, there's no reason on earth why your antagonist can't be German, you know, and there's no reason why your protagonist couldn't be, you know, whatever it is that you want them to be. And I don't think anybody would necessarily read that as you somehow in some very racist or knee-jerk way condemning an entire, you know, group of people. If you're playing more on stereotypes and tropes that are really over familiar and, you know, unpleasant, and your antagonist German characters, you know, has a little mustache and is clicking his heels and stuff. No, but you know what I mean? Like, if you're trading on racist tropes, then yeah, it's going to get read that way. So the particularity matters. I think also, you know, when we're dealing with particular groups, there is a sort of question of proximity to history. I think at this point in time, this long after, you know, the world wars of the previous century, nobody's going to automatically think, just because the character is German, that you're making some blanket assertion about Germans. Now, if you are writing a story at this point in time where you are writing about a politician running for office in the United States and there's the Russians, you know, hacking their emails or something, it's going to look a lot more pointed. It's going to look as though you have a particular political bias because of the proximity to current events, right? So I think that that's a little bit of a, and there's no reason you shouldn't write that one either, but I mean, I'm saying I think the way it's going to get interpreted by your reader is going to be swayed by the proximity of history. So, you know, to me, it doesn't look as though, I don't see a problem with that. In case I'm not fully understanding your question, though, feel free to give me a little bit more if you like. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, and I mean, as we always say, you know, if you're concerned about this sort of stuff, I mean, think about stereotype, think about tropes, find out as much as you can about groups that you're trying to represent,
and think about sensitivity readers.
Think about sensitivity readers, and don't have. I mean, if you don't have only a character. Like, don't have one type of character only. Like, if you're having a gay character, if they're the only one in the whole story, they're going to kind of represent something more than if there's more than one, for example. Or if there's more than one German, you can have more gray areas, right?
Yeah. So as I scan down, I see that they're actually using this history, these two characters, to be hurtful to each other. So they're, you know, one person's flinging back Nazi Germany, and the other one is complaining about another character's bisexuality, and they are using these things to hurt each other. But again, I think that the complexity that you bring to those individual characters and to their understanding of, you know, what they're doing when they use those terms and how they land, and it's all in the subtlety that you bring to it. I really think that, you know, it's gonna live or die in that level of detail and subtlety, and not just relying on tropes.
Yes.
Should we go on?
Yes.
Okay.
Chelsea Anderson, structure for two protagonists.
Yes.
So Chelsea writes, I'm writing a novel with two protagonists, and while they each need the other in the story to propel them forward, they have very different journeys. I'm wondering how this affects the theme of the novel. Does the theme need to apply to both, or can there be two themes? Interesting question.
It is an interesting question. I wouldn't mind a little bit more information from you, Chelsea, if you feel like offering it, so that we can answer a little bit more precisely. I think that there could easily be two themes, but they would have to be related in some way.
Feels
Otherwise, why are they in the same book together?
Yeah, I mean, if they're both having completely different stories, I mean, and why are they both in the same book?
Yeah.
Why are they not in two books?
And also, if these are characters who are in a relationship and whose behaviors are impacting each other, I think the themes are necessarily going to be related. You know, if
they each need the other in the story to propel them forward, so they are interdependent in some way.
Yeah.
Which suggests that the themes may not have to be exactly the same, but they're going to be, they're going to be.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, let's say that you're dealing with themes around identity, and one of your characters is, I don't know, one of your characters is a new immigrant to Canada, and one of your characters is a transgender character. Well, the lenses through which you're looking at these questions of identity are going to be slightly different. The thematic treatment's going to be slightly different in each case, but there is a larger kind of thing potentially linking them, which is, who am I? Who am I in relation to the people around me? How am I presenting to the world? You know, am I presenting my true self? Am I feeling that I have to hide my true self in some way? Do I have to not let people know that I'm trans? Do I have to try and speak without an accent? You know, like, they'll be related. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And that's I think it's a good example, because they're very different journeys, but yet there are commonalities.
And yet there can be commonalities, yeah. Roswell Teresa, Zumba all the way. Yes.
Who's watching right now?
Oh, hello. Question from last week. Oh, good. In my book, I have lots of chapters. One of my books has 4 pages to a chapter. One has 11 pages to a chapter. Is that okay? Like, how many chapter pages can you have in a book? Andrew?
It's all okay.
It is.
It is all okay. It really depends on the needs of the story in the chapter. I mean, I think we talked about this a little bit earlier. In some books, you can have a chapter with a few lines, a word, occasionally. I wouldn't do that too much. That's a bit gimmicky, but and some of them, some people don't even use chapters. They just have long sections.
I always mean to bring in, and I always forget, because we get this question actually quite often, and I always mean to bring in Ethel Wilson's novel, Swamp Angel. BC writers will recognize the name Ethel Wilson because there's a prize named after her, but she was a writer in a sort of mid-century, last century, and she wrote this book called Swamp Angel. And it's a fairly conventional novel. It's about a woman who leaves her husband to sort of forge her own way and try and have a happier life. And it's sort of post-war Vancouver, but not that far post-war. And you're reading along through this very conventional text, and it's got a little bit of sort of pre-Alice Munro kind of quality to it. And then you hit right in the middle, you hit a chapter which is 1 sentence long, and you turn the page and you're like, look at you being all like postmodern here, Ethel Wilson. What is going on? And it's really effective when you hit it.
It suddenly stands out.
There are no rules. There never really were any rules. It can be quite powerful. And you know, I think we talked, if you go back and watch last week's Hangout, we talked about YA and how there are a few more conventions the younger your reader age group is. So when you're writing for mid-grade, when you're writing for YA, there are certain more rigid expectations. But in adult fiction, and particularly in adult literary fiction, you have a lot of room to breathe, I think.
It's up to you as the author to explore how changing chapter lengths and scene lengths affects your story.
Yeah. And, you know, it might be natural, for instance, as you're getting towards a climax, or as you're moving into that third act and speed's starting to pick up, maybe your chapter lengths are getting shorter because that's affecting the pacing overall. You know, that would be a very natural.
And I know that certain types, if you're reading a thriller, I mean, you often notice that there are short chapters.
Yeah.
It works to keep the momentum, as long as the story works to keep the momentum going. Christy Webster, oops, I read that too fast.
That's okay.
Flashbacks. I've heard before that flashbacks are a crutch in writing and that I should use them sparingly. How do you find that statement? Furthermore, my character's first magic power is the ability to see the past of objects she touches, which will essentially be flashback. That's the power of flashback. Does that put the scenes into a different category than flashback? Finally, how long should the scenes be limited to if they are flashbacks?
All right, so we do have a number of questions this week all about flashbacks. And what I want to say is we go into detail in this very subject in our course on writing the draft. I actually went back and looked this up. Course 2, week 2, we have a whole section on flashbacks, backstory, memory, sort of incorporating all of those things. So if you want all the good stuff, we're going to send you over there, but I'm going to give you the Coles Notes version.
Yes.
We are going to give the Coles Notes version right now. So basically, I would say for the purposes of outlining, I wouldn't sweat it too much. If you know that you have backstory that you need to work in there, just drop it in for now. Flashbacks become problematic in the writing when they read as artificial, when you suddenly, I think the example we give is like in Wayne's World, when everything kind of goes ripply and Wayne kind of goes off into this long fantasy and then comes back and you realize the other person's just sitting there looking at him like, where were you the last 10 minutes?
Yeah.
We don't want to create that effect in fiction where characters are in the middle of a conversation, they're in a coffee shop, they're talking about, do you remember the time when? And then a character has this long, beautifully composed memory that goes on for 20 pages. And then they come back out of it and we're like, okay, what was going on all that time? Like, what was the other character doing? You want those movements back to be natural. So if somebody is having a long flashback, they have to be in a situation which can afford them that time. So they're lying in bed and they've got nowhere to go and they're just, nothing's going on. Or they're in a long car ride and they're driving and they've got time to have a 20-page, or jump away and come back and they're still in the same place.
Or you bake that into the structure of your book. So if there's a lot of backstory, then
like what she's talking about,
you would have chapters, but you may also have a chapter.
Yeah.
Like you can have, it's not uncommon. If you look at a book that people have often read, All the Light We Cannot See, there's a bunch of chapters that take place with characters in different time periods in their lives. Instead of having a flashback where everything's in the present, they just show you the thing that happened. Mm-hmm. And that if you have a lot of backstory and you need it for the story, then that's one way to do it.
I wouldn't even call it a flashback.
It's not a flashback, though.
It's more like a flashback is a more technical sort of.
But I think sometimes people do get a little bit confused with it. But this magic power,
looking at the magic power particularly, I think what I would want to say to you, Christy Webster, is you have to think about, if I'm the character who has that ability, how is that figuring into their day-to-day interactions with the people around them? So like if I come and sit down on this couch in Nancy's office and I touch it and I have this flashback to Nancy and IKEA buying the couch because that's the history of this object, am I getting just like a fragmentary image of a blue and yellow, and a meatball, or am I getting the whole story of that day? And she had to drop the dog at the daycare, and then she had to do this and that. And then how is that affecting her interactions with other characters in the scene?
And also,
I'm guessing fragmentary is probably going to be a way to go.
Yeah, and also, is that important to the story? Because imagine, let's say everything you touch, but let's say everything you touched, you see the past of objects you touch.
Nancy went to IKEA.
Yeah, this room is pretty straightforward. But at the same time, if that was someone's life, just like all the things we do that aren't necessary in fiction, putting on your shoes, going to the bathroom, there's a lot of eating, unless it's important to the story, you don't put it in. So this person could be having micro flashbacks all the time and just tries to screen them out and live their life.
Or maybe has the ability to choose whether or not they want to go to that place. And then presumably it's like, okay, here is the talisman that we have spent the first half of the novel searching for. Finally, I found it. I'm going to uncover a great big secret. Well, you're going to assume that they've built in the time into that particular
I'm going to sit in a dark room with a candle or something.
For them to sit with it and sort of absorb what they need to know from it. So you might be building into the scene, the character saying, okay, I need half an hour here.
Yeah, and it's all, again, about choices and the choices that help the story as much as possible.
Another question about flashbacks and subplots from
Cosgrove Reinhardt, I believe.
Okay. I understand that subplots will naturally evolve from your main storyline, but what about flashbacks? If you are using them to provide the reader with critical background information, how do you determine where to locate them in the novel without undermining the natural rhythm of the story? Should an act open with them as a standalone scene? Should the flashback scenes be woven throughout the act? What is more effective and less disruptive?
Some of it's going to be a feel, I think, to some degree. Feeling, and that's something that maybe readers also at a certain point can give you feedback on, whether if something feels right or not. I'm thinking of a scene that I've written in the book I have in progress, where there's a flashback that I've chopped into little pieces. And my main character is essentially waiting in the woods for something to happen. And as he waits in the woods, I start interleaving the slow progression of the morning with pieces of information from something that happened many years ago when he was also waiting and watching for something. So it felt to me like that was a natural place to put that. I wouldn't put it in a scene where lots of things have to happen, like we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm also very conscious that at this point we're talking about outlining, and I'm thinking,
yeah, maybe that's too much detail.
in terms of outlining, again, I kind of want to say it's almost a given that backstory is going to get moved around several times through the course of your multiple drafts. So for the moment, just knowing, okay, I need to include this backstory somewhere. I'm going to make my index card for it, and then I'm going to figure out, roughly. And I know it has to go before this point in the novel, so I'm just going to, make sure that you note it down, that where the precise placement is not super crucial at this point. Having said that, there are classic places where we do tend to go into backstory.
Right.
Beginning of the first act? No, that's a trick question. We don't want to start with backstory, typically. We want to start,
in media res,
in
right?
media res. We want to start where, you want to start in the moment with your protagonist and sort of have that stuff built in later. Beginning of Act 2.
Maybe because there's a natural pause, right?
Yeah, there's a natural change of pace there, right? After the busyness of the Act 1 climax.
There's been a commitment, a change. We're moving into something new, and now you've got a little bit of space.
And potentially going to a new place. Yeah. That's a very classic Act 2 move where it's like, I've decided I am going to go off on my journey, and then Act 2 is going to open in that new space. Well, that can be a new chronological space as well, where it might be, okay, somebody's found a photograph of grandma in a circumstance that they don't understand, and it looks as though it's implying something about grandma that they never really knew. And so the whole first act is, am I going to try and figure out what this thing is, or am I just going to stick it back and forget about it? No, I'm going to commit. I'm going to find out what this thing is. And that means I have to go to Antarctica, to the science station, to try and figure out what she was doing there back in the 1970s. So I get on the plane and I go and I land in Antarctica, and then I turn the page and Act 2 begins with grandma in Antarctica, and we get a little bit of backstory there. I'm never going to write this novel. This is a terrible novel, but
it depends if she found an alien spaceship or not.
Well, then it's worth writing as a novel, always with an alien spaceship. But you see what I'm doing there. Like, you're getting us to that new place, but that's also a very natural place where we might go and introduce something from another time period.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And because you're slowing down, and because the second act is so big and what's the word? It's like a carpet bag. You can just keep putting things in there if you want to. There's but I mean, it's a different pacing.
It's a big place.
It's a different pacing. Yeah. There's a generosity to the second act where you can sort of put these things in.
You've started things in motion. Readers are at this point, if they're still reading, they've bought in, and they want to see what happens next.
Yeah. Do you want to read?
Patricia Sandberg, subplots. I have a subplot that primarily involves one of my two protagonists, and I'm trying to build it into the main outline. But this raises a number of questions for me. The inciting incident, climax, etc. will be different than those events in the main story, although there may be some overlap. Some will also take place at different times than the main story. For instance, Act 3 for the main story will not contain any elements of the subplot, as the events in the subplot will have concluded. There will, however, be a reconciliation of the events of the subplot in the mind of the protagonist. My questions are, how closely do the events of a subplot need to mirror those of the main story, both in terms of having all the elements, inciting incident, climax, midpoint, etc., and should they occur around the time of the main story? For example, could you have a subplot that terminates early in Act 2 but continues to inform the actions and affect the protagonist, i.e., are there rules?
There are no rules. There are no rules. You can do whatever you want. Now, how well is it going to serve your novel?
Yeah, that's the rule.
That's what we're going to sort of talk about a little bit here. So if you go back and listen in earlier Hangouts, I think we've touched on this a little bit, the idea that you can have, I think we talked about it, not in relation to subplot, but in relation to character, which often will end up amounting to the same thing. Can you introduce a character in Act 2 who disappears in Act 2 and we never see them again? And we've said, your protagonist has to be there for the whole thing, but that under that sort of main big golf umbrella of the protagonist, you can have the parasols of, other characters, other subplots, other interactions that maybe don't take up the entirety of the novel. Do we want them to be complete in and of themselves? Yes, absolutely we do. Do they need all of the architectural detail that we would see in a full outline for the protagonist? Not necessarily.
You can imply a lot
do you need a
right?
midpoint in a subplot? Not necessarily. you know, a subplot, for instance, might be, let's say that we've got a detective novel and our character is solving a mystery, but at the same time, she's embarked on a romantic relationship with one of the people who may or may not be a suspect in the story. Well, presumably, you know, she didn't meet them on the first page. She may have met them once she committed to taking the case. So that was her first act climax. And then she meets the romantic possibility in the beginning of act two. That's totally possible.
Mhm.
Now, do we need to see commitment, crisis, climax, all of that kind of stuff? Like, how much of that do we need?
It depend. It'll depend.
It'll depend.
It'll depend. Certainly, a lot of stuff is implied. I mean, if you're going to be sewing things up at the end, or if certain subplots get resolved because of actions of the protagonist, I think, yeah, like I said, you can probably imply certain things that happen off the page, depending on how much. I mean, a story like that depends if that how important that relationship is in the novel. If it becomes really a strong part of the novel, you'll be showing more of it than if you would if it was a little more peripheral.
Yeah, yeah. But I'm thinking even with a romance, it's almost like you've got a structure in miniature. So if
Right.
the person's saying, hey, do you want to go out with me? And you say, what are you about to do? You're about to do your act one climax. You're about to say, yeah, sure, I will.
There's your commitment.
Is it a huge novel weight-bearing commitment?
No.
No, it's a little echo of that. But I mean, at the same time, it's still, that is still a structural kind of supporting beam.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Beginning, middle, end.
Beginning, middle, end.
Juliet is Dell.
I was on the wrong page.
Okay. Outline types, traditional versus scene by scene. I'm a week behind and trying to catch up. That's okay. I'm glad you joined us.
Yes.
What is the difference between the traditional outline and the scene by scene breakdown? It sounds like the only difference is that one may be on index cards and the other is a set of discursive paragraphs. Or is there more of a difference than that? We're going for time.
Oh, do we need to speed up?
A little bit.
There's not a huge difference, really. I mean, I think when we're talking about scene by scene, we're talking about an outline which is likely going to be fairly lengthy, where you're really going into some fairly granular detail. Whereas a sort of a narrative outline might only be 3 pages or 10 pages or something like that. We've talked to a lot of authors whose outlines are like 50, 100 pages. Now that's an extreme as well. I mean, when I write an outline, it's not 50 or 100 pages, it's maybe 8, 10 pages, right? And within that, I do manage to do a little microscopic scene by scene breakdown. But, you know, I think it's more a matter of detail and complication. It's the same approach, basically. It's not like you're using different, you know, sort of narrative elements or something like that. All of those are going to be the same, but with the index cards or scene by scene, if you do that, you don't have to be on index cards, but however you do it, that's just going into even a little bit more detail. Matting C, a diagram. Hi, I've tried drawing a diagram of the storyline because we talk about the climax, but there's a climax in Act 1, and then there's another climax. Potentially there's 3 climax, 1 for each act. Would it be possible to create one as a handout? And we haven't done that because this is actually a structure that is so... we did not invent this structure.
We are not, no, I mean...
we can't claim that.
Aristotle invented it?
No, not even, because he saw it in like Euripides and people. So
it's been around for a long time. If you want to see diagrams, there are many diagrams online.
Yeah, it's a Google screenplay.
I don't know if we'd be able, I don't know if we would do it justice with we would just take it from somewhere else probably.
We would do the same. We'd probably Google that. But I mean, you can see there'll be a million of them. We're not meaning to be facetious at all, Matting C, but we didn't invent this. I think Nancy draws one out for the 3 Little Pigs in one of her videos.
I believe she does, if you're looking at one where she's drawing on the screen.
Where she does that kind of like the swoop like that, which is what screenwriters will often use. But just Google and you'll find 3-act structure or 5-act structure. Which leads us very nicely to Juliet Isdel's next question.
What if you have more than 3 acts?
Yes.
I'm still in week 3 working on my Act 1 scene by scene thing.
Excellent.
But in trying to figure out where the Act 1 ends and Act 2 begins, I'm looking forward through all the scenes I have planned out, mostly written. And it's looking to me like I have 4 acts or maybe even 5. Does this mean it's Shakespearean? Haha. Does this mean I've got too much stuff, or does this mean I have to plan things differently? Or what does this mean?
That's totally fine. My first book... not my first book, my first novel had basically 5 acts, but I used a 3-act structure sort of over top of that. And the way I did it was the first act was present time, ending with my Act 1 climax. Then I went back in time and filled in some backstory. That was all of Act 2. Act 3 comes back to present time, and all of that Act 3 stuff happens, ascending stakes and midpoint and low point. And then we had Act 4, which was another movement back in time. And then Act 5 was the climax and the denouement. So there's still a 3-act, it's even, I'm not even calling it a 3-act structure, but I'm taking those key elements from a 3-act structure and just setting them over more acts. And that's definitely doable.
Well, and also let's look at television writing. I mean, they use
4
7
acts.
acts, 4 acts. I mean, in some, I mean, acts often connect to commercial breaks too, right?
Yep.
And there are people also who have alternate screenplay structures that are 6 acts, for example.
Yep.
So.
And the 3-act is very.
It's flexible. Right?
It's very Western as well. There's the
yes, that's true.
What's that? Tenketsu, the Japanese 4-act. I'm missing a syllable there, but I mean, there's other cultures definitely have other structures that are, just as valid. It's just we're teaching what we know, and that's Western structure. But again, it's not. With the novel, we are more flexible than screen and stage. We don't need things to happen like clockwork the way they do in film.
Yeah.
What we're doing is we're plucking out the narrative elements that are most useful for us in terms of generating character and conflict and keeping interest up over time. And then we're putting them into our lovely, much more flexible form than screenwriters have, because that's what a novel is. A novel is very, very flexible.
Mm-hmm. It is.
Okay.
All right.
Night Owl?
Now, Night Owl wrote a large chunk here.
Actually, you know what? We missed Margaret 1205, interview with Ian Weir. We mentioned an interview with Ian Weir. And where is it? And I apologize, that's a hangover from our earlier draft.
We've refreshed some
often flexed and changed the material to try and keep it current and, make sure that it's sort of technically up to snuff and all that kind of thing. So that might have been one that got cut from the cutting room floor somewhere, and I apologize for that. We'll go in and tidy that up for future iterations of the course, but occasionally you'll run into those little sort of hanging.
We might replace a video or update a video and then forget that we mentioned someone else.
So Night Owl, scene by scene breakdown. Scenes with only one person in them.
Okay, so this was a long question. And she puts in her breakdown here, but the question is at the end. So I don't think we can read the whole thing out, but we can basically paraphrase it.
We can paraphrase a little bit. So, I mean, the first question is, the more I work on my outline, the more I realize I need to revise my outline, and the longer my to-do list gets. I assume this is normal? Yes, this is normal. And really remember that the work that you're putting into your outline at this stage is work that you're taking away from yourself later. So you are saving yourself a ton of time by locating problems and saying, oh my gosh, I realize even within my outline that this little plot thread, this isn't working, this isn't hanging together. Resolving it there when you can sort of see the thing skeletal is so much easier, believe it or not, than trying to resolve it in the writing.
Oh, yeah.
So the more time and effort you take on your outline, believe me, you will thank yourself later. So yeah, it feels like a lot of work right now. That's how you know you're doing it right. If it's easy, you're probably not going into enough detail.
Yeah. So for her challenging scene. So she says, this is a scene where I have the protagonist alone in her mother's attic, sorting through boxes of stuff. She comes across a particular box holding things that shouldn't be there. Perhaps the Antarctica expedition logs.
I'm sure it's more interesting than that.
I wrote 2 outline entries because while I see the scene as being only men, I wanted to test it with another character because I know scenes are hard to carry with just one character and to see if there would be a difference. So she does a version of the scene with just men, and then she does a version with her unreliable mother. Okay. So
I think we're not saying you can never have a one-person scene.
No. So the question here is, so after she did it, she said there's definitely more conflict in the second one, but there will still be a scene where Min is alone with that box and that discovery. Reporting it in hindsight in a later scene seems to wash out the immediacy of the realization. She's discovered something important.
Mm-hmm.
Can these 2 scenes both be there? So this would be Min discovering it and being confused and then talking to her mother who has memory issues. Can they be there back to back in the order written? The first scene would be introspective, and then the second scene would be confrontational. Or is there a better way to use this documentation method for a scene with only one character in it? I realize that single character scenes are an aberration because sustaining the conflict is hard. But in most detective series thrillers, there are solo scenes where the sleuth is sleuthing alone, for example. Any thoughts?
Yeah.
You don't agree that they're necessarily problematic?
No, I think we can have scenes with only one character. We have them all the time. There's nothing at all wrong with that.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly at this early stage, when you're still outlining, when you're still, you want to capture every idea that you'd had. So I would say absolutely both those scenes, both. And then you can decide later, I want both of them. I only want one or other of them. I want neither of them. Maybe you realize at a certain point you don't need them anymore. But I would always, always, always at this stage err on the side of putting down too much, put down too many ideas. If you've got alternative sort of approaches to things, you don't have to choose right now. Your outline is about generating all of the raw material that you're going to be working with as you go forward. So always more rather than less. Having said that, is it possible for her to have an interesting scene? Yeah, I think absolutely, where she's digging through the box and pulling these things out. And this is where we might get sort of fragments of memory, or her sort of thinking, wait a minute, this doesn't square with, what I thought I knew about Uncle so-and-so, or, whatever. I think there's lots of space for a character alone with a box of unexpected, whatever it is, journals or photographs or memorabilia. I think there's lots of room for internal conflict.
Internal conflict, yeah. Definitely.
I want to hate this person, and now I realize that they were a lifelong blood donor, and I can't hate them. Look, here's all their receipts.
Perfect.
It's a terrible example. Terrible example, but you understand what I'm saying. Like I think you can mind conflict with just one character.
Okay, we better get zipping.
I'm sorry, I'm talking way too long.
Allison R., midpoint. How important is it that the midpoint come at the middle of the story? For example, if my midpoint seems to fall a little over 60% of the way through, is that an issue? Should I be trying to move it earlier in the story?
They will revoke your novelist's license.
It's true.
No, they will not. This is what I've been saying all along. The novel is very flexible. We have more room to breathe and more room to sort of fuzz the edges than screenwriters do, so that's totally fine. Don't stress about the midpoint.
Karina G., introducing multiple characters and jumping further in time. Act 2 of my story starts with the journey of the protagonist to another country. Mm-hmm. After I describe this journey that is relevant, I think, to the story, I jump 4 years further in the future, and then another 3 years to talk about a war between the two countries, and then again another 4 years to another event that is the climax of the story. How can this transition be done smoothly? So there's, in Act 2, journey, jumping ahead, jumping ahead, jumping ahead.
I mean, my instinct is to say, is it possible for you to shrink that up a little bit? Because it feels disjointed.
What's happening in between all these gaps?
Yeah, I mean, unless you're writing a Bildungsroman and you're just telling the life of this character, in which case
you skip over the boring stuff, maybe. I mean, it's hard to say. Jumps in time. I mean, they can be done. I mean, if your character is in a coma.
It might also but it might also be.
I'm being facetious.
We're not putting our characters in comas just to make time pass.
Time travel story. Travel stories always jump around in time.
No. I mean, it might just be a big book, a big ambitious book.
Yeah,
where
that's true.
This stuff is getting filled in. Like they're moving to a new country, and then they're getting married, and then they're having kids, and then their kids grow up to be soldiers, and the soldiers go off to the war. And, maybe that is the story that you're telling. But I do, again, I'm sort of thinking, where's the coherence here? What's the thing that makes all of this hang together? Or another way of looking at that same question for you, Karina G., is to say, why do these things have to be spaced apart in time? What are you buying yourself that is so valuable that you'll risk this sort of herky-jerky kind of approach to the structure and skipping out chunks of time?
Yeah.
So just put some pressure on that both ways and see how you answer those questions for yourself.
Yeah. There's a follow-up. Another question is about...
Let me read this one because you had some answers for this one, I think.
Yes, I did.
Another question is about a scene I have at the beginning of the story. The protagonist is having dinner with his wife and 7 kids. How can I introduce his kids in this scene without overwhelming the reader? Should I choose to focus on 2 or 3 of them and the protagonist's interaction with these ones? The scene is meant to show the protagonist as a loving father.
I would say I think your instinct is correct that you want to focus in a bit more. You don't have to. Each character in that scene does not have to have an active role. I mean, you could say the kids argued at one end of the table while so and so looked at Susie, who obviously was upset from her day at school, right? I mean, there is something that gives you the sense that, oh yeah, there's like a bunch of things going on, but we're focusing on what's important in the scene.
It's a lot for it to ask, especially at the beginning of a piece. It's a lot to ask the reader to track 9 characters who they haven't met yet. So if you can condense a little, like Andrew is saying, and just, you know, the little ones down at the foot of the table, you know, and you can come back and build them in later.
Yeah, you have a whole novel to fill out the people, but you focus, skim over background, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Joe Davies, MSFT, the role of escalation in Act 2. I think I have good plotting elements in Act 2 to escalate the danger and stakes for thwarting the spaceship heist. From danger to themselves, to proof of the danger, to discovery of the pirates being Libre rebels, to the role of the India Star fuel pods in starting the Libre Civil War. Andrew wants to read this novel very, very badly, I can tell. Can you comment on the role of escalation as it relates to character relationships, such as the protagonist to the other supporting protagonists and the protagonist to the antagonist and other supporting antagonists? And also the role of escalation in developing theme, or is theme supposed to be a constant across Act 2?
Well, I can talk about the first part.
Talk about the character bit, and I'll talk about the theme bit.
I mean, yeah, escalation is, as it relates to character relationships, is a way of putting pressure on the characters and their relationships and seeing what happens. People can sit in a room perfectly quietly, even though they may hate each other. But when you put them under pressure and they have to make decisions, then you're going to see where the rubber hits the road, as it was. You're going to see the truth behind a lot of things. And people have to make very difficult decisions. People are in conflict. That's when you get the truth out about a lot of things about character.
And then in terms of the development of theme across Act 2, I don't think you want a very static theme necessarily. What we're often going to see through an Act 2 is the theme becoming more complex. And so at the outset, it might be that the character has very strong sort of moral beliefs about X, and that's going to be the theme of your novel. And then they start to realize through the Act 2, oh, but there's this exception, and it's muddy around the edges there, and oh, this is not as easy as I thought it was. Often we're seeing complexity get built into the thematic concerns, which goes along with that idea of escalation, of making your character's life harder, more complicated. There's more to think about. So you don't necessarily need to change your theme or add themes, but we're looking for additional subtlety, nuance, complexity. Farhad?
Yep, on inciting incidents and flashback. Question 1. Can an act have more than one inciting incident?
Yes, absolutely. The example that came immediately to mind is the classic kind of romance movie of the young woman who has to go back to the small town that she came from, that she was trying so desperately to escape because her big city job in New York, she lost her job, and then her big city boyfriend in New York dumped her. And so she returns in, I don't know how to pronounce that word,
Ignominy.
Whatever it is. She returns with her tail between her legs to her small town, where she finds that the love of her life is hiding all along. Those are 2 separate inciting incidents, 2 different things, either of which on their own would have disrupted her stasis. And we happen to have both of them. So yes, absolutely, you can have 2 inciting incidents. Should flashbacks be well thought of in advance and included in the outline, or can the writer use them in the course of writing the novel as they see them appropriate?
If it occurs to you while writing that it would be good to put a flashback because something about your character has occurred to you, then I think you just pop it in.
Pop it in.
And then see what happens.
See what happens as you're writing. Inevitably, new material is going to come to mind as you're writing, but put as much into the outline as you feel that you're going to need.
For example, I mean, I have a list of flashbacks I'm working on right now, and it's an entire section of my outline where I'm just putting in potential flashbacks, which I will use or not use as they benefit the story.
The question about non-standard structure that we have next year, I think we've already actually answered that one.
Yes. So Aaron AG had a story about non-standing.
Yeah, the outline of a non-linear story. We already answered that one. So Joni HS.
Point of view of emotional turn.
Yeah.
Artistically, could there be a time when the emotional turn of a scene is altered to align with the protagonist's point of view? Or is the emotional turn exclusive to the author's point of view? Does this point of view need to remain consistent throughout?
I think there's 2 things. that we're kind of conflating here a little bit. And again, this is, I think the reason for that is because this is material that we go into, I believe we go into much more in the next course, where we go in detail into point of view and narrative, narrative voice, which, for want of a better way of talking about, is what you're here referring to as the author's point of view. It's not entirely that, but for these purposes. I think for the analysis that we're talking about with your scene cards, where we're talking about, you know, identifying those emotional turns, you're wanting to complete this from the character's point of view, so that you know whose mind you're kind of rooted in for that scene. So it's changing from positive to negative. Like, I don't know, two spouses are having an argument about something and one of them wins. So for the one who wins, it's negative to positive. Yay, I won. For the one who loses, it's, well, maybe not positive, but it's negative to more negative. We had a fight and I lost the fight and now I'm miserable. So, you know, which character are we seeing this scene from? That's going to affect that trajectory. Me as the author, I may look at that and, you know, it all comes out even in the wash, because maybe I'm equally invested in both characters. Me as the author, how I feel about this scene doesn't really matter. It's from the character's point of view that we want you to be doing this analysis.
Okay.
Lasantan?
Lasantan. Relationship between protagonist and antagonist. Almost there. Can the antagonist change from being the antagonist at a point in the story? Will that have a positive influence on the story or negative? Then can we add a new antagonist to keep conflict in the story? So will your antagonist not be an antagonist at a certain point? Will you join for that? I think that can sometimes happen. It's something that happens sometimes in, say, an Avengers movie, where there's antagonism between two groups, and then a larger threat appears, and they have to team up, even though they don't always like each other, against something that's much more dangerous. The stakes are much higher. So that's one example where that could definitely happen. And then it's kind of fun because you have an antagonism that then has to be pushed aside, pushed under the surface, but it also keeps existing perhaps as a source of other conflict.
That's right. And I'm thinking also in, you know, in the context of a novel, we might have a you know, if the overriding thing that the character is butting up against is a social, you know, they live in a certain society that is not friendly to some aspect of their personality, like they're a woman or they're LGBT or they're, you know, whatever it is that they're butting up against. You know, the manifestations of the personifications of those social structures can change throughout the novel. You know, here is a government office worker who I have to try and go get something from, and they're hostile to me. And then I go to university and my teacher is hostile to me. And then I go back home and my parents are hostile to me. You know, it can get embodied. Those forces of antagonism can get embodied in different characters. And they don't, each of those does not have to be constant throughout your book. But the constant will be the sort of social mores that are captured by those characters, for instance.
Yes, someone on the chat, Sarah, mentioned last season of Game of Thrones. Antagonists have to work out how to work together against a larger threat. Yes. I'm also thinking of Jennifer Egan's book, Manhattan Beach. Several protagonists. One of them is a woman who is trying to become a deep sea diver, essentially a naval diver during World War II, and has a huge amount of antagonism from an instructor who does not believe that she could do the job. And over time, she wins him over. And so he ends up becoming an ally at a certain point and then makes a recommendation. And it's an interesting switch. There's still lots of antagonism in the story, and there's other forces of antagonism. She goes somewhere else, and then he's vouching for her, which she's still going up against the societal constraints of being a woman in very much a man's world. But then she has this person on her side who's been won over. So it makes for, and that strengthens the story because it shows that antagonists aren't just one note as well.
That's right. And of course, I'm going to any kind of big epic like journey story or adventure story, something like The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, where they're traveling from antagonist to antagonist. And, you know, there is a goal that is the unifying thing, but it's not always manifested the same way. All right, Juliet Isdell, fiction versus real life.
Do you want me to read this?
I'm just trying to, it's a long one, so I'm seeing
We're
if
almost
we
out
can
of
just
time. I have a
summarize
meeting
it.
I have to run to.
Oh, do you? Okay.
I have a few more minutes. But.
In the current novel, I'm talking about forgiveness. In real life, it often happens that you say you've forgiven a person, you think it's settled, and then something new comes up and you discover there's some other aspect of the situation you haven't dealt with, and then you're angry all over again. You have to forgive the person all over again. And so in trying to represent this, I've got a collection of scenes where the protagonist and friends learn new stuff about forgiveness, try it out, it works. And then in the next collection of scenes, that feeling they were trying to get rid of has come back and they have to do it all over again. And the effect is one of wheel spinning. And Juliet Isdell also mentions this in the context of alcoholism or addiction, where anybody who's dealt with an addict, you sort of think, okay, they're clean now, it's going to be okay. And you go through it over and over again, and you feel like you're on a cycle. And this is where you have to think about narrative in terms of a slightly heightened reality, where we are looking to bring in, you know, those elements that, because you don't want to, I mean, in a way, addiction stories are profoundly boring because it is, you know, they're tragic and heartbreaking and awful, but it's the same thing again and again and again. And that's the tragedy of them. In the context of a narrative, you might want to increase the stakes each time. So the first time that the character gets drunk and, you know, they're 16 at a party and it's like kind of, oh, they're 16, just doing what stupid 16-year-olds do. And then they're a frat boy at a college party and they drink and drive. And it's like, oh my God, well, he's going to learn his lesson from that. You know, that's it. And then it's, you go out to celebrate the birth of your first child and get blind drunk and stay away from home for 3 days. And it's suddenly like, are you the person I thought I married? Do you see how the stakes are getting a little bit more each time? Now, does life go like that? No. I mean, obviously the blind drunk at 16 could go out and kill somebody drunk driving, and, you know, all of the drama could be up front. But for the purposes of constructing a narrative, we're looking for those little shifts and changes, and most key is escalations. Every time the wheel turns again, we want to see more is at stake, more is at stake. So I would, you know, with the idea of forgiveness, it's like, I'm going to forgive you for leaving your socks on the floor, and then I'm going to forgive you for, seeing somebody behind my back, and then I'm going to forgive you for betraying our country. You know, like we want the escalate. I don't know what novel this is. This is not a novel, but do you see what I'm getting at? Like, it's not just the same every time. There's new elements that are brought in. You're turning a kaleidoscope.
And you're increasing the pressure on the character.
So the final question, how do you represent a real life, slippery, intractable thing in a fictional world, which demands a relatively orderly sense of progress, building dramatic tension?
We talked about the first two. Resolution, I mean, it depends, I suppose, on the type of novel you're doing too. The resolution could be that the person finally comes to the light and appears to be heading in the right direction. Yep. The Wire.
Yeah, that's where my mind went just now, actually.
The character who was the addict.
In the last season, there's that wonderful sort of redemption story. I forget the character's
name, but he slowly but surely, through lapses, his struggle is to slowly but surely become a better person. And by the end, you feel pretty sure that he's on the right path. You know, knowing that there's nothing guaranteed in life.
Should we talk about the last question, since we are at the end?
The big ending.
This is a question about endings, and we did promise resolution.
I worked through my Act 2 outline. It feels right to have the crisis climax denouement run as the final 3 consecutive scenes. The final 3 consecutive scenes? Is there any issue with that? So one scene with the crisis, one scene with the climax, one scene with the denouement. How long are the scenes, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds more like short story pacing, but it so much comes down to the details, right? I could see a chapter for each. I could see, I mean, if they're big, long scenes. My fear there with a novel is very simply, you know, scope and pacing, and is that rushed?
Does it feel earned when does a reader feel like you've cheated them out of something that it's all just build up, and then suddenly it's like boom, 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 and you're done?
If it's able to be resolved so quickly, how big of a thing was it to start with? I mean, there's almost like that kind of a sense.
And climaxes often can be multi-part. The climax can be, you know, there can be false climaxes for people. They can get somewhere and then realize they still have another mountain to climb, and then they still have one more last thing, and then they think they have nothing left to give, and then they have one last final, you know, and then the movie's done, the story's finished.
And remember what all is involved in, and sort of wrapping up at the end as well. Think in terms of all of your subplots, which can be read as all of your protagonists' relationships with every other character around them. Have you resolved, or at least left each and every one of those at a place of renewed stasis, even if whether that's satisfactory or not? You know, are they, have you touched on each one of them? Are you sure you've tied
you
up all
messed
the
up
loose
yeah.
ends? So my fear for you there would be just don't rush it. This is something that's hard to see in the outline, though.
It is.
Again, and if you've got those 3 elements, if you've got just one scene card for each and those are there for your outline, that's still an incredibly valuable gift that you've given yourself, because now you know that ending that you're writing towards. So at this point, I think I want to say, yeah, that's probably enough for now. I'm guessing that this is a fairly high level kind of shorter outline. And as you go in and dig in and start working on your really fine-grained scene cards, you may find that you need a few more than just 3 to accomplish all of that work in the back end. But for the moment, I mean, I think we came out a little negative out of the gate there, but at the moment, I want to say it's good that you've even got that much.
Yeah.
Some people struggle even to get that much. And
bravo.
I suspect it's going to get bigger. That would be natural in novel pacing. But that may also just come out in the writing as well. So don't sweat it too much right now.
Yeah, and it's so much going to depend on when you're actually there writing it. Yeah, it'll be a different experience than when you're outlining.
Did we miss any online questions?
Nope, none on the chat. And if there's anyone submitted anything late to the, we can deal with it to the forum discussion area. We can deal with it next week.
Yes, and a thank you as always to the lovely Anna who did our
collating. We met in person recently.
Answering questions. We did. It was very nice. And we will see you here same time, same place next week.
Okay, and next week is week 5. We're getting close to the end. And
we're bringing it all together.
We're bringing it all together. Week 5 is endings and analysis. So you will be doing some work on endings. We're going to give you some tools of analysis, some further tools to look at your story.
And we will be talking about writer's block as well, because we're starting to turn our gaze very slowly from the scene cards to the actual writings.
Yes, the next step.
This is where everybody goes, I think I'm going to go watch Netflix.
On that note.
Maybe that's just me. I don't know.
No.
All right. Have a great week, everybody. Happy writing, and bring your questions for next time. We will look forward to seeing you.
Bye.
Bye. Oh, it's hot.